So just like we did for the North American Revolution and the French Revolution, we need to kind of provide the context of a little bit for Haiti, right? Only Haiti was not originally known as Haiti. It was prior to renaming itself, known as Saint Domingue, and it was a French Caribbean colony. You can see the island of Hispaniola. It's in the picture on the top right. The kind of western part is French Saint Domingue, and the um, eastern part is, um, sorry, I'm getting blown up on the text here, is the Dominican Republic, or formerly known as Spanish Santo Domingo. It is, or was at the time, regarded as the richest colony in the world, which is saying a lot because you had the Spice Islands, you had India, you had lots of other things, and the source of its wealth was sugar, right? Brazil produced a ton of sugar, but not compared to the plantations of Haiti. 50% of the world's coffee produced and 40% of the world's sugar at the time. And what makes Haiti interesting and different than obviously the North American Revolution or the French Revolution, and we talked about this as we looked at the source or the destination for the majority of slaves coming out of West Africa, was the Caribbean and Brazil. And Haiti defined this better than most. The vast majority of the population of Saint Domingue at the time was slaves. It was such an incredibly unbalanced pyramid that we're talking, less than 5% of the people on that island were free. And so, obviously, this kind of harkens back to what we talked about with French society, with strong social stratification between the classes, but not just the classes between the free white people or the free Frenchmen and slaves. There was also strong social stratification even within the white French classes. Again, harkening back to France. So now, revolution, revolution, revolution. How did let's kind of go back to the beginning. How did the French Revolution impact Haitian? And so the first thing we need to kind of go through and establish is that the revolution was not the same to everybody in Haiti. The revolution meant different things to different people. For rich white settlers, for example, their interest in getting involved in rebelling against the French government under Napoleon, their interest was autonomy, right? They wanted to kind of run the show themselves. We are the plantation owners. We are the elites on this island. We want more autonomy. And so the rich white settlers were kind of engaging with that, while the poor white settlers were saying, okay, well, autonomy is nice and all, but really we want citizenship, right? Just like the poor or peasant classes in France. But if you weren't a rich white settler or a poor white settler, if you were the very small population of African or Haitian descendants of Africans who had earned their freedom or were given freedom, um, the free blacks of Haiti were not after citizenship or autonomy. They wanted equality, right? They wanted um, not to be kind of looked at as second class citizens aligned with the slave class. And the slaves, quite simply, obviously wanted freedom. And so, what we're kind of describing here is in a society and on a small island in the Caribbean, you had incredible social stratification with rich white settlers, poor white settlers, free blacks, and slaves, all wanting different things, yet all engaging in the revolution itself. So the spark that lit it, just like we talked about, with the French Revolution and the calling of the Estates General and the tennis court oath, was actually a massive slave revolt. It began in 1791, just about a decade after the Constitution was signed in America. And this kind of spark that lit up Haiti immediately became a war between a number of different factions, the factions we described above: rich white settlers, poor white settlers, free black slaves, and the French. And so you can sort of imagine here that when you have a war on a small island like Haiti, right, where you have essentially five separate groups, none of which are aligned to the other, all of which are fighting each other, it's going to get bad quick, and it certainly did, and it got incredibly chaotic and bloody. But what followed was pretty predictable, right? Who or where does the power shift to as this conflict is unfolding? Well, it's going to shift to the subset of people that is the largest, right? And the slave population, as we already discussed, was enormous. And so the power gradually shifted to slaves, who were famously led by a former slave known as Toussaint Louverture. And this man, pictured here on the left, is actually one of like history's great badasses, and I think a really cool story and inspiring story. He was a former slave himself, never received any formal schooling, never trained under any great general or military mind, but he was brilliant. Right, and what he was able to do was play all the different sides off each other and um, basically demonstrate real military masterminds on the battlefield. He outmaneuvered all the European powers, got different players involved from Europe, and even defeated Napoleon in direct conflict. Again, Napoleon regarded as one of history's great generals. Here is a picture here at the time, kind of showcasing it. You can sort of see the lack of shoes, yet um, the uniforms stolen from Frenchmen who were killed. So now let's look at the effects of the Haitian Revolution. Obviously, first and foremost, let's establish that it was the first successful slave revolt in history. We talked about many months ago Spartacus's revolt in Rome. Spartacus being a Roman slave, leading a obviously very successful slave revolt, but even he was eventually defeated. Under Toussaint Louverture, right, the Haitian slave population won and established itself as the victor. It was the first successful slave revolt in history. And so, as Haiti is establishing itself as an independent, black run country in the Caribbean, in 1804, it renamed itself Haiti, drawing from the native Taino Indian language that basically, what does it mean? Hold on, I'm going to look this up because I didn't want to sound like an idiot, so I had to confirm. Yeah, it is basically the Taino Indian language for land of high mountains. It is very mountainous, which is why it was so good for coffee. But they're choosing that Taino language. There were no Taino Indians left on the island. If you remember Columbus and in the Howard Zinn article, those were the Taino Indians that were exterminated. And so the Haitians name themselves this to basically symbolize this break from Europe, basically saying, look, not only are we separate from you, are we no longer have anything to do with you, but we're going to actually choose a word that stands for and will perpetually exist as a finger in your eye to remind you of what you did here. And it was seen as payback. Now, while this is inspiring and kind of a cool story, especially Toussaint Louverture, the end result was not nearly as romantic, right? The economic devastation and destruction of the island was pretty much universal, was near total. You went from having the most um, profitable and richest colony in the world, 40% of the world's sugar, 50% of the world's coffee, to near total economic destruction. All of the plantations on the island were destroyed, and what was a money making machine to a global society and global trade that was basically developing that addiction to sugar and coffee catching on, um, was instead given to small farmers, which seems like a great idea, right? Here's all these slaves who've lived their life in bondage and have been seen as property. Let's reward them by giving them a small plot of land that they can, produce their own fortunes. And it makes sense. And, I certainly can't blame anyone. But the problem with that is um, it didn't work, right? These small farmers, the plantations divided up, like there was no export market. And so you went from a very profitable um, colony to one that was almost immediately in abject poverty. In 1825, the French actually sailed back across the Atlantic, surrounded Haiti um, a blockade of French ships, and basically said, "We're going to invade and take it back unless you agree to pay." what was at the time called an independence debt. And in today's dollars, it was truly massive. And so the Haitians basically said, you know what, the last 20 years have not been kind. We have not been able to generate much money here. We certainly don't have a strong military. What we were able to accomplish the first time, we worry is not repeatable, so we will pay this debt. The problem with this is it took over 100 years to pay off. And again, look at that, 1825, 100 years is 1925. And if you were to look at that number in today's dollars, you're talking about 300 billion with a B dollars. And so, when you look at Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world today, and certainly the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, I don't think it's an accident. And this is where we talk about causation. Like, how did that happen? What led to it? Where for the first 100 years of Haiti's independence, basically every dollar it was able to generate was going to paying off a debt. So hospitals were not being built, education systems were not being developed, universities were not being built, right? Infrastructure was not being constructed. And so essentially for 100 years, you're reducing what was already a poor country into total abject poverty. And so you can imagine, right? This is only about 100 years since then, and that's a huge, huge weakening in the very earliest years of its existence. But another effect of the Haitian Revolution, which is maybe a bit more inspiring, is that it did inspire many other slave rebellions. As we talked about, revolution and rebellion tends to be contagious, much like a virus, right? And so shortly thereafter, we started to see um, slave rebellions in Jamaica and other Caribbean colonies. And it gave strength, honestly, to the abolitionist movement. Suddenly, in North America itself, abolitionists were able to kind of tap into the fear of what happened in Haiti and said, look, you better free these slaves, you better end slavery, or what's going to happen in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama is exactly what happened in Haiti. What happened? Well, y'all got killed, right? And the land was basically taken from them. And so, you need to end this now, or this is going to repeat. In the short term, unfortunately, it did cause an increase in slavery, right? As French and other sugar producing um, European powers were basically smuggling in the very short term, greater numbers of slaves from West Africa to account for the drop in sugar production from Haiti. Um, and like I said, with the abolitionist movement, right, it terrified European powers. It deeply worried white elites wanting your independence in Latin America. And so, this next part, and I'll show the slides so that you can at least copy them down on your own time. We're going to talk about how in Latin America, under Simón Bolivar, right, the rebellion, or not the rebellion, the revolution progressed significantly slower. Instead of like months or a year, that revolution unfolded over decades, right? And the reason was they were very, very, very concerned that the hot mess that was Haiti between five competing powers and significant social stratification was going to unfold in Latin America the same way it did in Haiti. And so, the white elites led by Simón Bolivar said, well, we want independence from Spain, but we need to be very careful that we do not have a repeating of Haiti. Um, Also interesting, and you'll get this next year in U.S. history, the defeat of Napoleon by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti basically convinced Napoleon that his presence and France's presence in the Western Hemisphere was not worth the trouble, and it actually led him to sell the Louisiana Purchase to America. Now, I'll give you these so you can at least have them. Why did the Spanish American Revolutions begin? Why did the Spanish American Revolutions take longer? Why were the Latin American Revolutions successful? And what were the effects of independence in Latin America? All right. See you next week on Monday. Have a great weekend, everyone.